Porter asserts that the United States' involvement in Vietnam was more about military supremacy than concerns over the spread of communism in his new book, Perils of Dominance. He spoke about it recently at Politics and Prose bookstore in Washington, D.C. for about an hour, 15 minutes.
Thank you all very much for coming out this evening. It's great to see many friends and some whom I have not met who have the interest in this subject, which I certainly obviously feel deserves great attention so many years after the end of the Vietnam War. I wrote this book, Perils of Dominance, the subtitle of which is Imbalance of Power and the Road to War in Vietnam, because it seemed to me that the national narrative, if you will, of how and why the United States became involved militarily in Vietnam and ended up fighting a major war is extremely weak, if not non-existent. I say that because the national narrative is really not an explicit narrative. There's really not a book that has been written which says explicitly this is an explanation for why the United States went to war in Vietnam. And I think that is really a tragedy, has been a tragedy for this country for many years, because as we now see in the national discourse on Iraq, there's lots of talk about Vietnam in connection with Iraq, but it is not informed, I would argue, by a well-established, well-understood narrative as to why Vietnam happened. That is not to say that there is not a narrative about this question. I think that narrative is woven into the literature on the road to war in Vietnam. Much of it is implicit, much of it is bits and pieces here and there, which one has to use one's own logic to sort of pull together and make sense out of the story of why the United States went to war in Vietnam. This book is written in order to challenge what I think is that implicit, largely implicit, national narrative. And I will try to summarize what I think that's sort of subtext, if you will, of the literature as to why we went to war in Vietnam actually is. 3 points. First, the Cold War consensus. The argument is that South Vietnam was regarded by all the presidents from Eisenhower through Lyndon Johnson as so vital to U.S. interests that the United States had to intervene militarily in order to save South Vietnam from communism. That this was an agreement that was so universal that it basically drove the process of decision-making. Second point follows obviously very closely from the first, and that is that these 3 presidents, Eisenhower, Kennedy, and Johnson, and their advisors were driven by tragic misperception, an exaggeration of the threat of communism in general in the world, and particularly in Southeast Asia. And that misperception, if you will, was codified in the now infamous domino theory. And since the president is the commander-in-chief of U.S. military forces and has the full power of decisions to make war, full power over the decision to make war, it is assumed and often stated more or less explicitly that it was the president in each case which was the main force in driving the United States down that road toward war in Vietnam. And the third point is the idea that it was the Cold War confrontation with the Soviet Union and China, the idea that we all agreed upon, if we were alive in the 60s and the 50s, that we were involved in a titanic struggle for dominance in the world, who would be dominant and who would not be dominant, who would be subordinate in the world, between the United States and the Soviet Union and its Chinese ally. And that this confrontation which was so all-embracing, so all-encompassing in terms of our national life, understandably provided the context for this misperception. It lent itself to such an exaggeration of the threat of communism, particularly in Southeast Asia. Thus, the national narrative, which I'm talking about, ultimately puts the blame squarely on the weaknesses and bad judgments of national leaders, particularly the president, caught up in a global test between the two superpowers. And this makes Vietnam ultimately a sad, lamentable, tragic affair, but in the end one that can be understood as the result of the Cold War itself, almost made inevitable by this structure of a dual, two powers struggling for control of the world. And in a way, therefore, it is reassuring because it does not reflect a fundamental disorder of our national institutions or national system of politics. Many of you will recall, in fact, a book that was published soon after the end of the Vietnam War called Vietnam, The Irony of Vietnam, The System Worked, which, of course, was co-authored by one of the major authors of the Pentagon Papers, and which was based quite explicitly on the premise that Vietnam was the result of this massive misperception all along the way, from Eisenhower through Lyndon Johnson, in which the presidents were the chief drivers of U.S. policy and of the U.S. march into war. There's only one problem with this version of, or this explanation of the U.S. Path to war in Vietnam. It's simply not true. Not the Cold War consensus about South Vietnam, not the domino theory, certainly, as I will have more to say about today, and not about Kennedy and Johnson as the driving forces in their administrations into a war in Vietnam. So my book presents a completely different account of the dynamics which drove U.S. policy toward war in Vietnam. Not exaggerated threat perceptions or Cold War ideology, but complete U.S. military domination over the Soviet Union, and of course, by extension, of China as well. That dominance appeared to U.S. national security policymakers to give the United States a free hand in Southeast Asia and elsewhere in the world as well. A free hand, first of all, to undermine the Geneva Agreements, the provisions of the Geneva Agreements which called for national elections throughout Vietnam to unify the country in 1956, and then to ultimately to use U.S. troops to defeat the insurgents in South Vietnam and to bomb North Vietnam. In other words, my thesis is that it was not dominoes, but dominance that led to the war in Vietnam. The fundamental premise of Perils of Dominance, then, is that military dominance of the United States from the beginning of the Eisenhower administration to the big U.S. combat intervention in 1965 was the factor that shaped the decisions that led ultimately to a big war. Let me begin by trying to explain why I assert so confidently that there was, in fact, not a balance of power, but an imbalance of power, a fundamental imbalance of power, so dramatic that it was recognized by both sides and that shaped the decisions on both sides of the Iron Curtain. The conventional view of the military balance during this period of the Cold War from 1953 to 1965 is that the United States was certainly superior in nuclear weapons and delivery vehicles to the Soviet Union. No question about that. This has never been an issue over the last 20 or 30 years. But what is argued, I think, almost unanimously in the literature on the Cold War is that this was a situation in which American policymakers perceived that the Soviet Union had sufficient strategic power, a second strike capability, sufficient to destroy American cities, the details of which were really not important, and therefore that there existed a balance of terror, certainly, which was the functional equivalent, therefore, of a balance of power between the superpowers. I spent a few months really researching the documentation on the military balance as it existed from 53 to 65. And I found a surprisingly clear-cut case that it was not a balance of terror. That in fact, the Soviet Union never had a second strike capability at any time during this period, despite all the talk about the missile gap, which, by the way, of course, was always a future missile gap, not a present missile gap. It was a fear of what might happen in the future. Both sides knew at all times during this 12-year period that, in fact, the United States was the only power that had the ability to launch a first strike without fear of being destroyed, of having its cities destroyed by the other side. This is not even to mention the lack of any balance of power in terms of conventional forces, where the United States had the ability, certainly, to deploy conventional forces everywhere in the world, on the periphery of the Soviet Union in China, in the Middle East, and so forth. The Soviet Union, on the other hand, did not have the ability to project its power beyond a few hundred miles of the Soviet border. And this, of course, added further to the fundamental imbalance of power to which I refer. So why then is this so important for understanding the origins of the Vietnam War? Well, it's now clear beyond any doubt that Stalin's successors and the Chinese were so cautious about the danger of provoking the United States to use military force anywhere in the world from 1953 on, that they not only did not do as much as they might have to support the Vietnamese communists from 1953 on, they were absolutely committed to maintaining the status quo. Now, this, of course, is not new. This is something that has been documented over the years in the literature on Soviet and Chinese policy, particularly over the last decade. But what I found was that this caution was so extreme, was so clear-cut, it sent the message from the communist world to the Eisenhower administration in the first years from 1953 to 1956, those crucial years when the Eisenhower administration was making a series of decisions that really set in stone, not in stone, but set a direction of U.S. policy, which then became much more difficult to reverse. And that message was, here, you take it. We don't want to be involved. Please take South Vietnam. It's yours. And what I did was to really look at the suite of national intelligence estimates on the Soviet Union and Soviet and Chinese policy, as well as North Vietnamese policy toward the South, from 1954 through 1956 and even beyond. And the story that those estimates tell is one that is really quite compelling, that, first of all, the Eisenhower administration, Ike and Dulles, knew very well that the Soviets and Chinese had no intention of allowing any resumption of war in any shape or form on the Vietnamese peninsula, and that they believed, rightly so as it turns out, that the North Vietnamese were really not in a position to act independently of the Soviet Union, particularly, and China. So they believed, and again I would assert, based on the evidence which I present in the book, that the North Vietnamese were essentially checked. They were unable to do anything to challenge the United States and the government that the United States was supporting in South Vietnam to prevent the consolidation of power by that regime. And with each step taken by the Eisenhower administration, first of all, of course, to get rid of effectively the Geneva Agreement's provisions on elections, and then to take a fateful step, which was to carry out a covert operation in South Vietnam aimed at neutralizing as much as possible, destroying as much as possible of the stay-behind Viet Minh movement. which of course was ultimately what brought about the political military response by the Vietnamese communists in 1959, which resulted ultimately in a constantly escalating war in the early 1960s. Then finally, of course, the decisions that followed in the Kennedy administration, which believed in 1960-61, in the transition and the early part of the Kennedy administration, that the basic analysis which the Eisenhower administration had reached in the mid-1950s basically still applied. That the North Vietnamese would still be deterred by the threat of U.S. bombing from moving troops to the south. They would be deterred by that. They would be deterred by the Soviet Union's very strong resistance, very strong opposition. And they would be deterred by the fear that if they did get involved in a war with the United States, it might well result in Chinese troops on North Vietnamese soil. And contrary to the conventional view of the belief system of U.S. policymakers, they didn't really see an undifferentiated communist world. They were acutely aware of the differences in interest between the North Vietnamese and the Chinese, between the North Vietnamese and the Soviets, and between the Soviets and the Chinese. These were played upon very calculatedly by particularly the Kennedy and Johnson administrations, which is when these developments were becoming clearer and clearer. So in many different ways, layered on top of one another, the policymakers from Eisenhower through Kennedy and into the Johnson administration were getting signals which they were then translated into national intelligence estimates, which were being read by the policymakers. That it was really very clearly a case of the United States being able to move both on the covert level and overtly militarily into Vietnam without any fear of retaliation by the communist world. At a crucial moment in October 1961, when Maxwell Taylor and Robert McNamara, I'm sorry, not McNamara, but Walt Rostow, were sent to South Vietnam for an evaluation visit by President Kennedy. And despite the fact that Kennedy had told them in advance, in so many words, please don't give me any recommendations that call for the United States taking primary responsibility for the outcome of this war. Nevertheless, they came back with a recommendation for inserting initially 8,000 U.S. troops, but very clearly as only the first installment of more to come. And the main argument that they made in Maxwell Taylor's letter to the president is to me perhaps the single most telling document of that period, and that is Taylor said, look, this is not a situation where there's a danger of backing into a major land war in Asia. It's not a problem of risking another Korea. And that is because, and then he laid out this same set of relationships, of power relationships, in which the bottom line was the Soviet Union was afraid of the United States, and it's not going to cause any problem. And in fact, we can count on the Soviets to tell the North Vietnamese to cool it and to avoid going too far and provoking U.S. power. So this argument that it was the weakness and the fear of the communist world that gave the green light for the United States is the essence of my explanation for why the policymakers in the Kennedy administration were very strongly oriented towards the use of U.S. forces to try to quell the insurgency when it was still small. Now let me sort of double back for a moment and talk a little bit more about the Eisenhower administration's decisions. I've talked about them in general, but I want to talk first of all about what the Eisenhower administration's calculus was in regard to the French crisis over Dien Bien Phu and beyond, the failing French war effort of 1954, in the spring of 1954. The narrative that we've gotten up to now, if I can oversimplify it, has been that Ike and Dulles were prepared to go to war to prevent the fall of Indochina to the Viet Minh. But they were frustrated by two things. One, Congress laying down requirements, that one of which was the requirement that U.S. had to have the Allies on board, and not just sort of in some vague political way, but they had to have commitments from their allies, British and French, to a specific course of action to prevent this. And secondly, the British refused to go along, and that made it impossible for the United States to intervene. But otherwise, the Eisenhower administration, led by Ike and Dulles, were bent on intervention in Vietnam, in Indochina. What I found to my surprise, really, when I delved into the documents that are available, is that the evidence is very clear that neither Ike nor Dulles had any intention of military intervention in Indochina under any circumstances during this crisis. From the very beginning, Eisenhower was absolutely dead set against any military intervention. He told the National Security Council in no uncertain terms this would be a terrible thing for the United States. And it was for a very simple reason. He understood that the Viet Minh were too powerful, that they had too much popular support. He talked about that quite explicitly. He talked about the fact that the Vietnamese ambassador, the Vietnamese meaning our Vietnamese, ambassador in Washington had told him that perhaps 2% of the population of Vietnam believed anything about the promises of the French about independence. And so he took to heart that factoid and warned that if the United States were to replace the French, even later on, the Vietnamese would simply transfer their hatred from the French to the Americans. And it would be a terrible tragedy for the United States. So it was not simply the strength of the Viet Minh militarily, it was the issue of colonialism that made it impossible for Ike and Dulles to think seriously about military intervention, which is not to say that there were not those in the administration who were not bent on a military intervention. We know that Admiral Radford of the Navy was in fact leading the charge within the Eisenhower administration among national security officials who believed that the United States should intervene in Vietnam. But there was never a time during this crisis when Eisenhower or Dulles saw any reason to change their mind. They were playing out, it's now clear, a scenario in which they would use the U.S. military dominance over the Soviets and the Chinese to carry out an operation in diplomatic coercion, intimidation, if you will. There would be, according to Dulles's plan, there would be a warning to the Chinese, conveyed in much the same way that Ike and Dulles thought that they had done to end the Korean War in 1953. Chinese would be warned that if they didn't bring the Viet Minh to heel, if the war didn't end on terms that were acceptable, there would be consequences which would not be specified, but which clearly would be not in the Chinese interest. As it turned out, that was never done, but Dulles came to believe that simply by gesturing and making public statements that suggested the possibility of U.S. military intervention in Indochina, it might well be enough to have the Soviets and Chinese back on their heels, putting pressure on the Viet Minh to agree to terms that would be much more acceptable to the United States. And that, of course, again, turned out to be quite true, that, in fact, the Soviets and Chinese did do precisely what Dulles had hoped would be the case, that the Viet Minh were put under pressure to agree to a settlement that was really, in many ways, much more favorable to the French and to the United States behind them than would have been justified by the military political situation. Now let me talk about the domino theory. This is, I think, the granddaddy of all myths about the Vietnam War. And it's amusing to me to see how often the domino theory is still cited in almost reverential terms as, you know, the real problem here that we had in terms of the consciousness of policymakers and presidents. The fact is that Eisenhower did not believe in the domino theory at any time during this crisis, privately derided it, and in fact privately in his dealings with the national security staff, the national security team, instructed them specifically to have a fallback position, what he called a fallback position, in case the French lose in Indochina. The fallback position was to be built around Thailand as the new sort of anti-communist bastion in Southeast Asia. And it was based on the very clear assumption that if Indochina falls, the rest of Southeast Asia is not going to go with it, that we have, you know, plenty of options to stabilize the area without inordinate fear of a collapse of political will or anything else in the area. And what this reflects, and I document the sort of checkered history, if you will, of the origins of the domino theory, which came under the Truman administration in 1949, 1950, after the Chinese communists seized power on the mainland. There was a perception, a real perception, without question, that Southeast Asia was an area where the West was very weak. The communists were gaining strength rapidly. The Chinese, newly empowered on the mainland, were militarily formidable. They were aggressive. And there was very little to stop them, except for this waning French military strength in Indochina. And therefore, by God, we've got to support the French, because otherwise you have a situation that is rapidly disintegrating. Hence, you know, a theory arose during that period that was not called the domino theory, but the house of cards or something similar to that, which was that if Indochina were to fall to the communists, to the Viet Minh, that the rest of the area would certainly follow. But by 1954, you have a very different situation. The calculus of the intelligence services and of the leadership of the government, specifically Eisenhower and Dulles, had changed dramatically. China was no longer regarded as a formidable military power. It was now understood that the Chinese were really quite weak, and indeed had already begun to turn the corner away from sort of a militant foreign policy, and now looked to be, after all, only human. And in fact, perhaps beginning to turn inward, to turn towards a defensive policy. So, and Southeast Asia itself was no longer viewed sort of undifferentiatedly as a weak sort of area where there was basically going to be a vacuum of power if the French left. It was now seen that there were independent governments, or the areas which were still under colonial control were not in immediate danger of collapsing, and that indeed Thailand didn't regard itself as a domino at all. In fact, Dulles at one point testified before Congress that he'd gotten some flack from the Thais, who were upset that they were being portrayed as merely as dominoes rather than as an independent, stable state in the region. And so I think, you know, there's great accumulation of documentation which shows that although there was a perception about falling dominoes or a similar kind of dynamic that existed before 1952-53, by 1954, by the end of 53, it was clear that Ike and Dulles had a very different view. And that is why the announcement of the articulation of the domino theory on April 7th, 1954 by Dwight D. Eisenhower was not a reflection of his real strategic views at all. It was a political ploy, a diplomatic ploy, to hint, underline to the Soviets and Chinese that the United States is raising the stakes in this conflict, and to put them on notice that they'd better take seriously the possibility that the United States might do something that would involve the use of force. So essentially, based on this one instance in which Eisenhower put forward a rationale, if you will, for policy that he didn't even believe in at that point, you have then set in motion this very strange phenomenon whereby ever after, anyone of any consequence politically in the United States was sort of put in the position of having to endorse the domino theory or being regarded as somehow weak and wishy-washy on communism in Southeast Asia. And that's why I make the argument in the book, both Kennedy and Johnson publicly endorsed the domino theory, but in private, there's lots of evidence that they were both profoundly skeptical about that argument. And that therefore, this leads me then to the final major point that I want to make, and that is that neither Kennedy nor Johnson were the driving forces in their respective administrations for the march to the use of force in Vietnam. And in fact, I argue that both Kennedy and Johnson resisted the pressures and the entreaties of their advisors, which were in both cases virtually unanimous at certain times in the administration for the use of force in Vietnam. In Kennedy's case, it was for the use of U.S. ground forces to go in and deal with the insurgency, or either that or to use U.S. ground forces to intimidate North Vietnam, to combine it with a threat of bombing so that they would begin to pull back and allow the South Vietnamese to consolidate their position. In the case of Johnson, of course, it was beginning the bombing of North Vietnam. This was the key issue on which the national security team of Johnson was clearly already hell-bent by early 1964. Let me just say a word about JFK. The problem of Kennedy's relationship to Vietnam policy has unfortunately gotten mixed up with the issue of Kennedy hero or anti-hero. The popular sort of book reviews and sort of polemical articles by Noam Chomsky and others have treated this issue as, you know, anyone who denies that Kennedy was the quintessential Cold Warrior on Vietnam is simply a Kennedy worshiper. Well, when I started this book, I was really not persuaded that that this was wrong. I mean, I regarded Kennedy as basically a Cold Warrior. What I learned in my research surprised me, and it is that Kennedy has to be viewed as a man who was really isolated in his own administration on Southeast Asian policy. And I include there both Laos and Vietnam, South Vietnam. When he made the decision in the spring of 1961 to negotiate the neutralization of Laos instead of fighting to support a right-wing military force there, his administration really turned against him virtually unanimously. There was not a single high official of his administration who supported his decision. And I will make a partial exception here, of course, for Averell Harriman, who Kennedy named as his personal negotiator to negotiate the neutralization of Laos. But everyone else in high positions, in policy-making positions, in the State Department, in the NSC, the National Security Staff, including, of course, Mac Bundy himself, CIA, and of course the Pentagon, including McNamara and his deputy, and the Joint Chiefs of Staff, they were all unanimous in believing that this was a huge mistake. And in some cases, and I include here officials of the Far East Bureau of the State Department, some of the military people, some of the CIA people, believed that Kennedy had clearly gone off the reservation and that this was a sign that he was not up to the job, that he was really one step shy of some kind of treasonous action. I quote an oral history by the Deputy Undersecretary of State, Hugh Alexis Johnson, under Kennedy, who says that he could only conclude, based on what he saw about Kennedy and his policy, that JFK had made a secret deal with the Soviets at the summit in Vienna without telling his own administration, and was pursuing this sort of secret policy of giving away Laos, in effect, to the communists, because that's the way they perceived it, that this is what the effect of Kennedy's policy would be. And they told him so. Kennedy nevertheless persisted in that policy. And in the process, he encountered then additional pressures which came from the same elements, but particularly from Maxwell Taylor, from the same State Department people, and from Walt Rostow in the White House, but presumably with at least the tacit understanding of Bundy, to try to get Kennedy to change his policy of negotiating neutralization and to turn towards military intervention in southern Laos, which would be for the purpose not only of stabilizing the U.S. position in Laos, but also setting up the future intervention in South Vietnam as well. Kennedy rejected that plan that was hatched by these people, but interestingly, never put anything on paper, never formally stated in an NSC meeting that he was saying no to it. And this point has been noted by more than one observer in his own administration. There's no question that what Kennedy was afraid of was that people in his own administration would use this against him. And this brings me to the key point that I think is very important to understanding both the role of Kennedy and of Johnson in Vietnam policymaking. Our understanding of the nature of presidential decision-making on issues of war and peace, particularly in a situation such as we had in this period of the Cold War, where the American public had been convinced that the United States faced this very powerful, formidable enemy, which was bent on world conquest, and which was engaged in a, frightful contest of strength with the United States all over the world, and particularly at that point in Vietnam and Laos. Those circumstances lent themselves to a situation in which a president who was a calculator and not a bold leader who was ready to take the consequences politically, as Kennedy was. I mean, he was not a bold leader, a weak leader who calculated everything and tried to hide behind others if he could. Kennedy believed that he had to have the support, the understanding, the willingness to go along with his major policies on Laos and Vietnam, or at least on Vietnam, in order to avoid a situation where he could be attacked by his opponents, and that attack would be supported in some fashion, directly or indirectly, by people within his own administration. The same thing applies to Johnson, very clearly, that he was afraid that if he did not have the support of the key national security advisors, particularly the Secretary of Defense and the Joint Chiefs of Staff, but even most importantly the Secretary of Defense, for a policy of refusing to go ahead with bombing North Vietnam, the consequences could be very, very serious. Not just that he would be attacked by the Republicans, that was taken for granted, but that he would not have the support of his own major national policy, national security advisors. And then this brings them to the decisions that Lyndon Johnson made over a period of 15 months from the time he entered the White House in November 1963 to the fateful decision, the final decision, to have to agree to an open-ended war in South Vietnam. During that period, contrary to the general view that LBJ was the arch hawk of his own administration, he refused the advice and the pressure, in some cases, of his national security advisors to go to war against North Vietnam no less than 10 times in 15 months. He finally gave in. And by the way, this resistance by LBJ did not weaken after his election. It got stronger. It's because of that I document the case that the tension between Mac Bundy, Bill Bundy, McNamara on one hand, and LBJ on the other became very, very acute in the weeks and months after LBJ was elected, because his national security advisors believed now it's time for LBJ to step up to the plate and do what's right. Okay, now he's gotten elected, let's get to work, LBJ. And he refused to do it. He did nothing. Day after day, week after week, LBJ sat on his hands, despite the fact that he was being advised by his national security people that if he did nothing, the result would be a neutralist government coming to power in Saigon, which would ask the United States to leave. Well, here's the interesting thing. LBJ had said on at least 3 occasions to Bundy, McNamara, and Dick Russell that, and I'm not quoting the words, but he said that being asked to remove U.S. troops by a peace government or a neutralist government in Saigon would be the one way that I can get out. He said that in no uncertain terms. He said, well, if that happens, we're not going to send our troops, are we? Of course, that was not acceptable to McNamara or Mac Bundy. And on January 27th, they sent a memo to LBJ which told him, your policy of passivity is not acceptable. Again, these are not the exact words, but the effect of it was to say to LBJ, we cannot accept a policy that would allow a situation to arise that would be a national humiliation, being asked to withdraw our troops by a neutralist government. So here you have very clearly the crunch point between a set of national security officials who are determined to go to war and LBJ still resisting in the belief that he might still get off the hook if he waits long enough. So this is why I make the argument that the view of LBJ in the literature is still fundamentally wrong, and that we need to have a completely new view of where the real threat comes in terms of the pressure to go to war. And this, I think, is not simply a lesson that is relevant to the Vietnam period. We are once again today in a situation of unipolarity, of U.S. military dominance over everyone else in the world. There's no one else to balance off U.S. power and to say, if you do that, you'll pay some consequences. You have to reconsider. And, you know, there's no question that the dynamics of policy that led to the war in Iraq have an uncanny similarity, an uncanny parallel to the dynamics that led to Vietnam. And my argument is that this is really only the beginning, that this is the template for future wars, as long as the United States is in this position, and as long as our domestic institutions have not changed to constrain much more effectively than they have in the past the willingness to use military force, we will face that same situation again in the future. Now, one may ask, how long can this future last? And that's a legitimate question. But what I'm saying is that as long as we have a unipolar era remaining, this is really the fundamental structural problem that we all face, and which is, I think, really presents a much more fundamental challenge even than many of us might have appreciated, despite our perhaps pessimistic view of the possibilities for restraining U.S. power. So with that, I'll stop and I'll invite questions from the audience. Thank you very much.
If everyone could come up to the microphone, that'd be so great. Okay, thanks.
Thank you very much for first spending so many years doing this research and for so eloquently really debunking some very important myths about the Vietnam War. And I think you've done that pretty effectively. What I don't understand is what led us to go into this war still? You told us why we didn't, but why did these national security advisors want it? It couldn't just be that we had the power, because there were other places we didn't go in. So why Vietnam?
Well, there are two different questions here, I think, and you ended with why Vietnam as opposed to why do it, even if you have the power to do it. And I think those are two different questions. To answer the first one, the why Vietnam first, that's where the U.S. unchallenged supremacy, if you will, in a political military sense in the world was breached. And so logically, that's where the provocation was clearest in terms of using force. So I don't feel like there's a mystery about why it was Vietnam. I do think that there's a larger question, which I thought you were posing here. Yeah. So the larger question being, okay, you know, the United States did have a free hand, let's say, or thought they had a free hand. They didn't really, but they thought they had a free hand because of this extreme imbalance of power. But so what? I mean, why should we really care if they didn't believe in the threat of communism, as I argue that they did not? They understood that the domino theory did not really apply in this situation. And my answer is this, and I think this really, I'm glad you've asked this question. It's really fundamental to an understanding of what's going on today. And my answer is that we have to grasp the notion that a power that has this kind of dominance has the opportunity to dominate the Middle East or Southeast Asia, given a different set of circumstances, is going to exercise that because of the psychological and other rewards that go with dominance, with domination of not just a single country, but a region. What I didn't talk about here, I didn't have time to get into, is that I document that they were worried about something. It's not that the policymakers, the national security advisors, had no worries. They did have a worry. But it was not the threat of communism in Southeast Asia. It was the threat of the rise of neutralism. They were afraid that there was this constant sort of pressure from neutralism, not only in Southeast Asia, but elsewhere, and that they had to do something to try to stave it off. And so, you know, particularly in Thailand, the great fear was that if we were too weak, if we didn't fight, if we didn't bomb the North Vietnamese, at least to show that we were still tough, the Thais would go neutralist. And they're right. There was every reason to believe that that's true. The Thais would see that there was no reason to continue to support a policy of surrounding, threatening, trying to weaken and isolating China, which was the basic Cold War policy in the Far East. And therefore, you know, the Thais would have undoubtedly shifted their policy toward one of making peace with China. They did not want that to happen. Why? Because they had all these Cold War programs, budgets, personnel, perks, bases. You know, they had all the status symbols that went with these programs, and the psychological satisfaction of being the dominant power. I believe that we have to grasp the notion, I'll say the word, imperialism exists not because we need the oil, not because we're going to get the oil cheaper, but because of the desire to dominate, the desire for power in and of itself. This is a very profoundly un-American notion. And Americans have a great deal of difficulty grasping this. I've been asked this question every time I've given a talk so far, and I think it's very, very interesting. Yeah.
Dr. Porter, you said that you began your research captive, perhaps, to the conventional wisdom about President John Kennedy, that he was sort of a quintessential Cold Warrior and aggressive in general in pushing U.S. military into Vietnam, at least the training forces we had there. But of course you changed your view at least somewhat in that regard, and my question has to do with that in specific. You also, just a moment ago, mentioned that you think that U.S. policymakers were mostly afraid of neutralism more than communism. My question has to do with one of the leading neutralist nations of the time, India, and our U.S. ambassador, of course, to India at the time, John Kenneth Galbraith. I believe in your book, in your research into the archives, and especially with regard to the role of Averell Harriman that you already mentioned at the State Department, that you have discovered a chapter, a heretofore unknown chapter, about President Kennedy in 1962 through Ambassador Galbraith, perhaps an effort to negotiate a settlement with North Vietnam, and that Kennedy, in fact, was sabotaged in that regard by Averell Harriman. Could you tell us about that?
I would be very happy to. Thank you. That's a wonderful question. It gives me an opportunity to talk about something that I did omit today, and that is that, you know, the one point that historians have all agreed on unanimously about JFK was that he simply was not interested, in fact, disagreed with the idea of negotiating peace in South Vietnam. And what I did find, in fact, was that Kennedy not only sort of looked at a proposal for negotiating with the North Vietnamese, which was submitted by Galbraith, but then followed up in mid-April of 1962. Interestingly enough, on a day when his advisors were trying to get him to meet to talk about why the United States should oppose a peace conference on South Vietnam. Instead of meeting them to talk about that, JFK gave the order to the State Department, to Averell Harriman's shop, because he was then the Assistant Secretary for East Asia, that Harriman was to send a cable to John K. Galbraith and to tell Galbraith that he was to contact the Indian Foreign Ministry and to find out if they could help set up a channel to the North Vietnamese, and that specifically the content of the message that was to be passed through that channel was not simply that we wanted to talk to them, but that we were prepared to have mutual de-escalation with the North Vietnamese. He couched it very specifically in terms of the possibility of partial movement by both sides, a response by the United States to a partial reduction in the level of fighting, for example, in South Vietnam, so that you could have set in motion a dynamic of both sides responding and moving towards some kind of settlement. Well, that to me indicates a guy who's thought beyond J.K. Galbraith in a way, because Galbraith's position really was, we should talk to them about the possibility that if they turned off the insurgency, well, we could talk about trade, and maybe ultimately we could even think about going back to the Geneva Accords of 1954, which might possibly result in elections which might unify Vietnam. So he was going beyond that and thinking in terms of conflict reduction. To me, that is a telling point about JFK's mind and the way it worked, particularly on Southeast Asia. Then, the kicker on this story is that basically what Averell Harriman did was to undermine, sabotage what was an important, potentially important initiative by JFK. Instead of telling his deputy for Southeast Asia that this was what JFK wanted, he told him that he was to write a cable to Galbraith, which would basically say, if the North Vietnamese don't stop the war, well, we'll go after them. In other words, exactly the opposite. And then in the end, when the Deputy Assistant Secretary wrote much more something like what JFK wanted, the cable never went out. It just didn't go. There never was a cable to Galbraith. So this is a very interesting case, which I have other cases in my book which show how the national security bureaucracy, high-ranking officials, undermine, sabotage, and take the power of decision out of the hands of the president. That's one example. Another one is when McNamara did not tell LBJ about the change of heart on the part of U.S. commanders in the Gulf of Tonkin. After they initially said our ships are under attack, the commander of the vessels, the two U.S. vessels in the Gulf of Tonkin, said, well, I'm not so sure now, and sent a message back, and the U.S. command in Hawaii then passed that on to Washington. And McNamara was told about it quite directly, but he never told LBJ about it. I'm quite certain of that, and I document the case in the book. Then the third case that I talk about is how Dulles took the power of decision on the Geneva Accords, on the all-Vietnam elections, out of the hands of President Eisenhower, and made the decision himself. He pulled it out of the NSC and on a completely bogus excuse, and quietly made the decision on his own. So I think there is a pattern that one can discern throughout this whole period of, at strategic points, these high-ranking bureaucrats, and in the case of Dulles, I mean, the most trusted advisor to Eisenhower, obviously, taking decisions which really did belong with the president himself.
A very, very quick follow-up question just on Kennedy. Is there anything in the Kennedy papers that shows whether the president discovered that his orders, if that's what they were, to Harriman to pass this cable on to Galbraith to proceed affirmatively with a secret negotiation with North Vietnam? Is there anything in the Kennedy papers to show that the president ever realized that he had been sandbagged and sabotaged?
I have not seen anything. I've not found anything.
Gary, congratulations on a different theory than the many books that have been written about why we went to war. As you know, I wrote the biography of Mike Mansfield fairly recently, so Mansfield's activities are close to my mind. Mansfield was in touch...
Don, you should introduce yourself. I'm sorry.
Yeah, I'm Don Oberdorfer, former Post reporter and now at SICE. Mansfield was in touch directly with both Kennedy and Johnson. He believed in being direct. I mean, he was Senate Majority Leader, and he could do it, and he did it. And he was very much opposed to the war, as you know. With Kennedy, he strongly advised Kennedy not to go into Laos. Unlike Kennedy and Johnson, Mansfield had spent a lot of time in Southeast Asia. He'd been in Laos and Vietnam and Cambodia countless times and knew the territory and knew this was a total loser. And he argued with Kennedy, and in the case of Kennedy, he took his advice on Laos, but at the end, but then of course he made some other moves. At the end of the, just a few weeks before he died, he told Mansfield that he couldn't do it now because the election was going to come up in 1964, but after the election he was going to pull the American troops out of Vietnam. Whether he would have done it or could have done it is an open question. With Johnson, Mansfield argued repeatedly, don't do this. It's going to be a disaster. And what he got back from Johnson was, don't worry, you know, we're going to take care of it. This is very important. We can't let this drop. Some of those statements were written by Bundy and others, but some of them were directly from Johnson himself. So I can't really fit your portrait of these two guys together with the interaction that Senator Mansfield had with the two of them, and I don't know if you have an explanation for it or what.
No, it's a very good question. I mean, it's really pointing to the important distinction here that I didn't go as far as I could have in trying to clarify. On the part of LBJ, he clearly did not want to go to war. On the other hand, he was not prepared to set in motion negotiations at that point. I mean, what you're talking about is Mansfield telling him he should negotiate neutralization. And you're right, Johnson was not prepared to do that, and he fended off Mansfield on that point. And I think, you know, he felt that if he moved towards negotiations at that point, he would be subject to, he would be attacked for having given away South Vietnam. And he, you know, as I say, I think he felt that his best bet was to sort of keep his options open and hope that, you know, the situation in South Vietnam would evolve so that we would be asked out. I'm not denying that there's a big difference between LBJ and JFK on this point. JFK was a negotiator. He felt comfortable with the idea of negotiating, even though, as I say, I mean, JFK hid behind others, did not want to be out in front, and I argue in the book, and I make a very detailed case, that JFK really, you know, used, first of all, McNamara, and later McNamara and Taylor as his stalking horses. Basically hid behind them their advocacy of the troop pullout plan on a timetable by the end of 1965. But it was his idea. He initiated it. But Johnson was not comfortable with that. He was very much afraid of taking the initiative to negotiate. And secondly, he was being told that the North Vietnamese were not interested in negotiations. He was being told by his advisors, and I'm sure you have come across this, but for 15 months, he was told by Secretary Dean Rusk, Secretary of State Dean Rusk, that the North Vietnamese are not interested in negotiation. They'll never agree to anything that's even remotely reasonable. He did not tell LBJ about the North Vietnamese acceptance of U Thant's proposal for a secret meeting without preconditions. and he did not tell him about other signals from North Vietnam in early 1964. He kept this from him for, up to, through 64 up to January 65. He kept this from him until LBJ finally found out in late 1965. By that time, it was a different situation, obviously. So, I mean, part of my case rests on, again, what LBJ thought he knew, what he thought he knew which wasn't true.
Just a very brief follow-up to that. I sat in these briefings with Secretary Rusk and Secretary McNamara in that period of time. I don't believe that Dean Rusk could ever have kept something from President Johnson. I don't think it was in his character. I don't think he could have done it. I don't think he would have done it. He might have de-emphasized something or emphasized something more, but I simply don't believe this guy was a square shooter if there ever was one. He was convinced that the United States would win the war. He kept saying to us, when the military power of the United States is applied, nothing can stand in his way. But I don't believe that Dean Rusk was capable of any kind of deceit with respect to the President of the United States. But that's just my view.
I think what he was capable, I think what he was capable of doing was interpreting the signals from the North Vietnamese as not serious and therefore not worthy of the President knowing about.
I want to thank you for the work you've done and the fact you've been very loyal on this issue for many, many years. I also have some books in my head. I've spent the last few years translating the writing of Ho Chi Minh and Vuong Nguyen Giap, including General Giap's memoir of Dien Bien Phu, which recounts the negotiations in Geneva. And so my area of interest is a little more back in time, and I'd like to roll this back a bit and raise the question not just of communism, but it seems to me from looking at the Vietnamese side of the story that so much of this in the international politic was a question of nationalism. And if you roll back to the end of World War II in 1945 and the Declaration of Independence in Vietnam in September, Vietnam was the first country of note to come out and declare its independence. Not the first country, but the first one that would be recognizable on the map, and that was a tremendous threat, including to the United States, which had colonies, and certainly to the French. And so I'd like to hear your I'll just add, and maybe you all know, that we funded 78% of the French war, including the Battle of Dien Bien Phu. So we had a very heavy financial investment, and we had pilots there, and American airplanes with French insignia on them, and so forth. In some ways, we need to be very careful, I think, that we don't start the story in 1954, because it was already heavy, heavy military investment, psychological, political investment at that point. And what I know from being a researcher, and Gary and I intersected many, many years ago, I know that you loop back before that. So I think it would be very useful for us to hear your point of view on that,
Well,
because I know you know much more than what you said.
You're right that the United States took the wrong path much earlier for reasons that had nothing to do with the military dominance that I talk about from 53 to 65. And this has to do with, the U.S. refusal basically to recognize the independent government of Ho Chi Minh in 1945 and its tacit, really quite explicit decision to support the return of the French when they did come back. And I think that there's no question that the essence of that policy was a combination of sort of commitment to the traditional imperial structure of power in the world, the League of the Imperialists of Britain, France, the Dutch, and the Americans, which was very much, the rationale within the State Department for that. Plus, I think, perhaps an unstated but very important element, which was racism of U.S. policymakers and diplomats even in the region. Not all of them, by any means, but, key people in key positions. Really, were quite explicit about the idea that, well, these Vietnamese clearly, don't have the capacity to govern themselves. And even in 1954, despite what I said about Eisenhower, being a realist and recognizing that if we intervened in Vietnam, the Vietnamese would hate us as colonialists, imperialists. Nevertheless, he could still say in an NSC meeting, these Vietnamese, they clearly, don't deserve independence because they they can't govern themselves. In sort of one of these moments of pique. So this goes very deep in the U.S. policymaking elite, and that really is an essential part of the process by which the United States took the wrong path earlier on.
Good afternoon, Dr. Porter. I find a couple of your points to be very interesting. One is not as surprising as the other. The one is that through 3 administrations, the U.S. government believed one thing and told the American people quite the other. They told the American people and sold the need to intervene in Southeast Asia on a host of these myths and incorrect propositions. Domino theory, we must fight them here or we'll be fighting them in San Francisco, and all the rest. And unfortunately that seems to be ringing very true about the situation in Iraq today. But really the thing I find the most provocative and disheartening is that it appears that your point is that Kennedy and Johnson, and to a lesser extent Eisenhower, were somehow being driven by, they weren't driving policy, they were responding and reacting to their advisors. It would seem, at first blush, well, why didn't he just fire them and do what he wanted to do?
Yeah, I mean, I would not use the term figurehead because I think it sort of deprives us of the complexity of the dynamics here between the president and his leading advisors. But nevertheless, I do think that we have in fact oversimplified in the opposite direction for decades. We have portrayed the president as the supreme leader who is unchallengeable and who basically drives the policy agenda. That's clearly not the case. We now know that you have here a very complex bureaucracy with resources, assets that put them in a very strong position in an implicit, not an explicit in most cases, but an implicit process of pushing and shoving between the president and his advisors. Now, I didn't talk about the fact that even Eisenhower, who was a war hero and who was did not feel that he was under the same sort of political pressure that JFK and LBJ did, nevertheless was still very conscious of the fact that he had this war party within his own administration. A few key officials in the administration, particularly in the military, who still believed that the United States should intervene in Indochina. And instead of, sort of confronting them straight on and saying, no publicly or, to renounce their position or fire them or anything like that, both Eisenhower and Dulles basically took an end around. They took a kind of deceptive approach, which was to argue that, well, we now realize that if we intervene militarily in Indochina, it's probably going to provoke a counter intervention by the Chinese. And that was the main argument they used within the administration against the war party. Now, they didn't believe that. In fact, the CIA, as I document in the book, only a couple of weeks after this argument was used within the administration, issued an estimate which said exactly the opposite. Again, reaffirming that the Chinese had no intention of intervening militarily, even if the United States intervened militarily and had the possibility for destroying the Viet Minh. The Chinese still wouldn't intervene because of their appreciation of the power imbalance. So basically the bottom line is, I think we need to rethink the whole relationship between this very powerful and very determined in a whole lot of different circumstances, national security, bureaucracy, a set of national security institutions and their leaders on one hand and the presidents on the other.
It sounds like the core of the argument is basically we do this stuff because we think we can, and then the fear of national humiliation keeps us there because, and I guess my question is if you could talk a little bit more about what you see as the antidote to this sort of kind of thinking, and in particular with respect to national humiliation. Have you thought anything about what kinds of face-saving gestures, we might be able to come up with to get us out of the mess that we're in now?
Good question. To start with the last part of your question, I do believe that any situation in which a dominant military power is involved in a war and sort of finds that it's gotten in too deep, it has all kinds of negotiating options. And that was the case for the United States from the beginning in Indochina. We could have negotiated, we could have arranged for all kinds of settlements which would have been perfectly acceptable to the American people, and which would have obviously given us a much better situation in Southeast Asia than what we finally ended up with, not to mention the United States itself. The problem is that when you're the dominant power, you're driven by a certain set of assumptions and a certain dynamic, an internal, political and bureaucratic dynamic, and you don't know where to stop. You really don't know where to stop. That's my conclusion, that these people couldn't figure out, well, you can go this far, but if you go farther, then you're going to obviously provoke unnecessary resistance, and therefore, you should wise up and begin to figure out, how do you accommodate the legitimate interests of the other side and, make the deal that is going to give you your basic interests, without any problem, but will not result in your dominating Vietnam or Southeast Asia in the way the United States wanted to. And this brings me back to the first part of your question. The problem is that, they don't want a face-saving gesture. They want dominance. I think that's the problem that we have with the policymakers who got us into Iraq. I'm actually writing a piece right now on how the United States could negotiate a responsible exit strategy in Iraq. The problem is that there's no desire for a responsible exit strategy because the fundamental premise of the policy is that this is what we do in order to maintain this larger position of power. It's all coming back ultimately to that, rather than to, I don't think it's, it's not threat of national humiliation. I would take that somewhat with a grain of salt, that, use of that argument, because that was only within the context of a much larger argument which still believed that we had things pretty much our way. We still had a free hand to use force. And you use force, that's how you get what you need. That's the belief of those who start down that path. And it's very difficult to turn it around, as you indicated. One more question? Yeah.
Yes, I would like you to comment on the military-industrial complex and its relationship to these wars.
This is another part of the overall picture which I, did not address in the book because it's, it is related. It's linked. Obviously, the interests of people who are ready to use force, who have that agenda, is inevitably part of a broader phenomenon in this society in which you have vested interests in maintaining this system. The system for, not just defensive wars, not wars for defending the homeland or defending, even a reasonably coherent line of defense, but wars that have to do with domination of other areas. And I should say that, this is a terribly complex thing to disentangle, what is cause and what is an effect. And I'm, at this point, I don't feel that I'm in a position to really give that kind of analysis, but I think it's a very important topic that really requires a lot more research and a lot more analysis, for sure. What is the relationship between the psychological rewards of a policy of pursuing dominance, not just military dominance, but political military dominance of a specific region? How does that relate to other kinds of interests in the society? And it changes over time. And I believe that it is not the same structure of interest that existed during the Vietnam War era. We now have a different structure. It has a different set of players who are related in different ways to the military, to the industrial powers of the country. I think you have now policymakers who are out to make a buck, much more consciously than the McNamaras and the Bundys, who were, liberals who thought they were really public servants. They weren't interested in making a lot of money. That's no longer the case now. So this is one wrinkle in that set of relationships. I think we're all out of questions, so thanks very much.
Gareth Porter was co-director of the Indochina Resource Center in Washington, D.C. from 1974 through 1976. He's author of Vietnam, The Politics of Bureaucratic Socialism, and A Peace Denied. His latest, Perils of Dominance, is published by University of California Press. Visit ucpress.edu for more information.
Completely different account of the dynamics which drove U.S. policy toward war in Vietnam. Not exaggerated threat perceptions or Cold War ideology, but complete U.S. military domination over the Soviet Union, and of course, by extension, of China as well. That dominance appeared to U.S. national security policymakers to give the United States a free hand in Southeast Asia and elsewhere in the world as well. A free hand, first of all, to undermine the Geneva Agreements, the provisions of the Geneva Agreements which called for national elections throughout Vietnam to unify the country in 1956, and then ultimately to use U.S. troops to defeat the insurgents in South Vietnam and to bomb North Vietnam. In other words, my thesis is that it was not dominoes, but dominance that led to the war in Vietnam. The fundamental premise of Perils of Dominance, then, is that military dominance of the United States from the beginning of the Eisenhower administration to the big U.S. combat intervention in 1965 was the factor that shaped the decisions that led ultimately to a big war. Let me begin by trying to explain why I assert so confidently that there was, in fact, not a balance of power, but an imbalance of power, a fundamental imbalance of power, so dramatic that it was recognized by both sides and that shaped the decisions on both sides of the Iron Curtain. The conventional view of the military balance during this period of the Cold War from 1953 to 1965 is that the United States was certainly superior in nuclear weapons and delivery vehicles to the Soviet Union. No question about that. This has never been an issue over the last 20 or 30 years. But what is argued, I think, almost unanimously in the literature on the Cold War is that this was a situation in which, in the world, between the United States and the Soviet Union and its Chinese ally, and that this confrontation, which was so all-embracing, so all-encompassing in terms of our national life, understandably provided the context for this misperception. It lent itself to such an exaggeration of the threat of communism, particularly in Southeast Asia. Thus, the national narrative, which I'm talking about, ultimately puts the blame squarely on the weaknesses and bad judgments of national leaders, particularly the president, caught up in a global test between the two superpowers. And this makes Vietnam ultimately a sad, lamentable, tragic affair, but in the end one that can be understood as the result of the Cold War itself, almost made inevitable by this structure of a dual, two powers struggling for control of the world. And in a way, therefore, it is reassuring because it does not reflect a fundamental disorder of our national institutions or our national system of politics. Many of you will recall, in fact, a book that was published soon after the end of the Vietnam War called Vietnam, The Irony of Vietnam, The System Worked, which, of course, was co-authored by one of the major authors of the Pentagon Papers, and which was based quite explicitly on the premise that Vietnam was the result of this massive misperception all along the way, from Eisenhower through Lyndon Johnson, in which the presidents were the chief drivers of U.S. policy and of the U.S. march into war. There's only one problem with this version of, or this explanation of the U.S. Path to war in Vietnam. It's simply not true. Not the Cold War consensus about South Vietnam, not the domino theory, certainly, as I will have more to say about today, and not about Kennedy and Johnson as the driving forces in their administrations into a war in Vietnam. So my book presents a logic to sort of pull together and make sense out of the story of why the United States went to war in Vietnam. This book is written in order to challenge what I think is that implicit, largely implicit, national narrative. And I will try to summarize what I think that's sort of subtext, if you will, of the literature as to why we went to war in Vietnam actually is. 3 points. First, the Cold War consensus. The argument is that South Vietnam was regarded by all the presidents from Eisenhower through Lyndon Johnson as so vital to U.S. interests that the United States had to intervene militarily in order to save South Vietnam from communism. That this was an agreement that was so universal that it basically drove the process of decision-making. Second point follows obviously very closely from the first, and that is that these three presidents, Eisenhower, Kennedy, and Johnson, and their advisors were driven by tragic misperception, an exaggeration of the threat of communism in general in the world, and particularly in Southeast Asia. And that misperception, if you will, was codified in the now infamous domino theory. And since the president is the commander-in-chief of U.S. military forces and has the full power of decisions to make war, full power over the decision to make war, it is assumed and often stated more or less explicitly that it was the president in each case which was the main force in driving the United States down that road toward war in Vietnam. And the third point is the idea that it was the Cold War confrontation with the Soviet Union and China, the idea that we all agreed upon, if we were alive in the 60s and the 50s, that we were involved in a titanic struggle for dominance in the world, who would be dominant and who would not be dominant, who would be subordinate. American policymakers perceived that the Soviet Union had sufficient strategic power, a second strike capability, sufficient to destroy American cities, the details of which were really not important, and therefore that there existed a balance of terror, certainly, which was the functional equivalent, therefore, of a balance of power between the superpowers. I spent a few months really researching the documentation on the military balance as it existed from 53 to 65. And I found a surprisingly clear-cut case that it was not a balance of terror. That in fact, the Soviet Union never had a second strike capability at any time during this period, despite all the talk about the missile gap, which, by the way, of course, was always a future missile gap, not a present missile gap. It was a fear of what might happen in the future. Both sides knew at all times during this 12-year period that, in fact, the United States was the only power that had the ability to launch a first strike without fear of being destroyed, of having its cities destroyed by the other side. This is not even to mention the lack of any balance of power in terms of conventional forces, where the United States had the ability, certainly, to deploy conventional forces everywhere in the world, on the periphery of the Soviet Union in China, in the Middle East, and so forth. The Soviet Union, on the other hand, did not have the ability to project its power beyond a few hundred miles of the Soviet border. And this, of course, added further to the fundamental imbalance of power to which I refer. So why then is this so important for understanding the origins of the Vietnam War? Well, it's now clear beyond any doubt that Stalin's successors and the Chinese were so cautious about the danger of provoking the United States to use military force anywhere in the world from 1953 on.
Porter asserts that the United States' involvement in Vietnam was more about military supremacy than concerns over the spread of communism in his new book, Perils of Dominance. He spoke about it recently at Politics and Prose bookstore in Washington, D.C. for about an hour, 15 minutes.
Thank you all very much for coming out this evening. It's great to see many friends and some whom I have not met who have the interest in this subject, which I certainly obviously feel deserves great attention so many years after the end of the Vietnam War. I wrote this book, Perils of Dominance, the subtitle of which is Imbalance of Power and the Road to War in Vietnam, because it seemed to me that the national narrative, if you will, of how and why the United States became involved militarily in Vietnam and ended up fighting a major war is extremely weak, if not non-existent. I say that because the national narrative is really not an explicit narrative. There's really not a book that has been written which says explicitly this is an explanation for why the United States went to war in Vietnam. And I think that is really a tragedy, has been a tragedy for this country for many years, because as we now see in the national discourse on Iraq, there's lots of talk about Vietnam in connection with Iraq, but it is not informed, I would argue, by a well-established, well-understood narrative as to why Vietnam happened. That is not to say that there is not a narrative about this question. I think that narrative is woven into the literature on the road to war in Vietnam. Much of it is implicit, much of it is bits and pieces here and there, which one has to use one's own